I'm Eric Alexander. I'm the Executive Director of the Brigham Education Institute. It's a pleasure to have all of you join us today, and really want to thank my friend and colleague Doug Smink for being our discussant today. Doug is the Vice Chairman of the Department of Surgery here at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. He's the Chairman of Surgery at Brigham and Women's Faulkner, and was a longtime Program Director in the General Surgery Residency, and in this context here is the Editor-in-Chief for the Journal of Surgery Education, and a good friend and colleague who helps out with all things education within the Brigham Health system. The real fun here was asking him to speak on the insights of an editor and really helping us from a medical education research standpoint, and as people growing in the field as a healthcare educators understand how to move forward with an academic publication. So with that, Doug, thank you, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks for inviting me. Thank you all for joining. I am looking forward to sharing a bit with you and having a discussion, and hopefully giving you a little insight into the world of publishing in research and specifically medical education. It's great to join you. First of all, this is my journal. It's not really my journal, but this is the journal I'm the editor of, and it's the Journal of Surgical Education. I have my first disclosure is that my journal is good, but it's not great. And I just say that to say it's, it doesn't have the impact factor of the New England Journal or JAMA, or even some of the journals within surgery, like Annals of Surgery or JAMA Surgery. But it's a really strong journal. And we'll talk about how you sort of evaluate journals and what their impact is. And for those of you, I'm assuming everybody's an education researcher. I find that the world of education is more and more of interest in the research world and in the academic world. I still remember when I started as a new faculty in the Department of Surgery at the Brigham, and Mike Zinner was my chair at the time, and he said, well, what do you want to do with your career? And I said, I want to focus on surgical education. And he said, well, I'm not sure there's a lot that you can get published or get funded in that, but I'm willing to help you try. And that was all I needed. He left the door ajar just enough. And, I have found that not just in this journal, but in a lot of our journals, and I think that goes beyond just journals that are focused on education. There's a lot that's getting published in the education world, and people are really interested in it, and people want to talk about it. I think the big equalizer is that basically everybody has been educated. And so they're happy to share with you what their education was like. And they're really interested in where is education going. And so education research is really key to that discussion. And actually, it's been really a joy to be part of this journal because we've tried to help shape surgical education. And hopefully we're doing it little by little. This is a quote that I like to share because when I became the editor-in-chief, a good friend who's a surgeon at another institution, now a department chair, he texted me and he said, congratulations on being the editor of JSE. That's what people call it, JSE. And I said, I think he's the editor of, I can't remember what, but a very prominent surgical journal. So I said, well, it's nice. It's a bit of a niche journal. And he responded, it's a niche journal, but it's your niche. And I think everybody here, surgical education, I'm going to assume is your niche or one of your niches, and you got to find your niche. And for me, surgery education is it. And I'm going to share with you what we're doing with our journal. I think the last thing to know as an editor-in-chief is that I don't actually edit very much. But I'm going to try to walk you through the process and help you understand what my role is, and maybe give you some tips that will make you more likely to get to this. So this is my goal for all of you, is to help get your papers to the point where they're accepted, which is really a great achievement. And I recommend this. This was recommended to me when I was very junior, still as a resident and starting to write papers. And I recommend it to all of you. Getting your paper published, getting it accepted and published is a great achievement. And you should celebrate every time you do it. So whether it's a bottle of champagne or a nice bottle of wine or going to a movie or whatever it is that you do, you should celebrate every time you get something published. Because yeah, there are people out there who publish 300 and 400 and 500 papers, but for most of us, it's a hurdle to get over and it's a challenge, and getting your name in print is really fantastic. So I encourage you, hopefully I can help you with this, and I encourage you to celebrate it when it happens. Okay, here are some things I've learned, and we'll talk about them a little bit more. But number one is that being an editor is actually hard. I assumed that I would just sort of, these papers would be sent to us and I'd pick the good ones and send back the bad ones, and it wouldn't really be that much work. But it's actually a fair amount of work. And in part, it's because the work never stops. So as you all know, because we all do it, people write papers all the time. Some people write them during the normal business day, but a lot of people write them at night or on weekends, and they submit them whenever they can get them in. So there's never a day that goes by we don't get a submission or multiple submissions now. And so the work really never stops. And every week there are more papers for me to review. And I'll talk a little bit about it, but our volume of submissions has gone up markedly, which is true with a lot of journals in the last couple of years. Publishing is a business, and I don't completely understand it, but it is truly a business. We are a journal that's published by Elsevier, which is a huge publishing house. And there's I have an assigned publisher. He manages actually 10 different journals. They're all in surgery. I think they're almost all in surgery. And he's helped sort of open my eyes to his perspective on journals and why they want higher impact factors and more pages in print. Some journals advertise, we don't, but more subscriptions, and actually how they do subscriptions. So it's pretty rare now that we have individual subscribers. Mostly it's institutional subscriptions, and our journal is one of 10 or 20 or 100 journals that an institution might subscribe to from Elsevier. And so as our journal gets more downloads, views on their website, it becomes more profitable for Elsevier, and that's what they're looking for. And then the other thing that I think is really important, and I didn't understand this until I was an editor, but as a researcher, I think the sense I had, and you may have the same, you may be more enlightened than me, but I had the sense that journal editors were trying to keep my paper out of their journal. And that was their job, that they were going to find what was wrong with my paper and send it back to me with a rejection. And actually, that couldn't be further from the truth. Journals want your papers. They want to publish good papers. They want your papers if they're good. And that's the key, is making sure it's good. But we really do want to publish the best. And now it's quite frequent. Somebody will tell me about a paper they're writing, and I'll say, well, you should send that to the Journal of Surgical Education. We would love to publish that. Now, I don't guarantee them publication until it's been reviewed, but we're looking for papers that will elevate our journal. And so what are we looking for? I always tell people it's good science. And Christina and I were talking about this a little bit just before we started. But, when I first got involved in education research, there was some that was really science and had rigorous methodology and good controls. And there were some papers that were just sort of a series of learners or their opinions and didn't really get into real hard outcomes and didn't have real good methodology. We want and expect to see that now. In education research, particularly in surgery, which I know better than other forms of or other disciplines, has really elevated. And we get really quality articles on a regular basis. And if you don't have good science, it's not generating new knowledge, and it's not with a good methodology, it's unlikely to get published now. The other thing that we're looking for is things that are well written. Now, there are different ways you can think of well written, but scientific writing needs to be very clear. It needs to be concise. It needs to explain things well. It doesn't need to be flowery, but it needs to be well written so that readers want to read it. And it needs to be interesting. It needs to be novel. We are not looking for the 20th paper that says the same thing that the last 19 did. We want people to be doing innovative interventions and doing research on them or confirming something that others have done. But we don't want to, we're not in the business of publishing things that have already been published multiple times and aren't really going to advance the field. And then I think a lot as an editor about my readers. So I have a good sense of who reads my journal and what they want to read. And partially that is because my journal is linked to a society It's the Society of the Association of Program Directors in Surgery. So it was started as really something for residency education. It's grown beyond that. And I know that our readers are also clerkship directors and core key educators, they're coordinators, they're administrators in vice chair roles and things like that. But I have a pretty good sense now of what my readers want to read. And so I want to make sure that I'm giving them that type of product. And then a really important thing for journals is are other researchers going to read my articles in our journal, and are they going to cite them in theirs? And that gets into the impact factor. And I don't know how many people know how an impact factor is calculated, but basically it's a ratio. And in the numerator is the number of times papers in your journal were cited. The denominator is the number of papers in your journal. Okay, so that means that for the New England Journal with an impact factor, I think of 45 or 50, that means every paper they publish is going to get cited in the next 2 years on average 50 times. So the New England Journal is going to get a submission, and then one of the questions they're going to ask is this going to get cited 50 times? If it's only going to get cited once or twice, it's probably not going to get in. My journal's impact factor is a little over 2. So that means every paper that we publish is likely to get cited on average 2 times in the next 2 years. Not huge, but respectable. And actually, when I started, it was just barely over 1. So we've made some progress there. You know, I put this slide in just to help you think about, there are lots of different things that you can publish, whether it's in medical education or just in general. But I think as you look through education journals, and some of these are categories we have and some are from other sites, but original research is still, I think, the majority of what's published in the education world and obviously beyond the education world. We have some other sort of features that we do publish as well that don't really require a lot of data or a lot of original research, but we think are helpful to our readers. So perspectives, obviously somebody's perspective on some aspect of surgical education. And then because a lot of our readers are either program directors or clerkship directors, we have a concept or a section called How I Do It, which is really just an explanation of sort of a novel innovation that people might want to share with other educators, but may not have data to study, either because it's too early in the innovation or it's not really something that you can collect data about. And I put Last Page, which is from academic medicine. I know the BEI has sort of done a virtual form of Last Page. Another sort of way to get some of your thoughts out there. My sense is that people are very willing to put out their thoughts and perspectives and how I do it, at least for us. We have many more of those than we publish. The acceptance rate for those is lower than it is actually for original research. That may not be true with every journal, but it is for ours. I think one key, and I'll talk about this, is you want to make the job for the editor and the reviewer easy as you can, because as I described, it's a busy job. And so one of the key things is just following the rules, and every journal has slightly different rules. But you want to format your submissions in the right format. So if you're going to do something, whether it's original research or perspectives or whatever it might be, just make sure you look on the journal website and you have it in the right format, the right length, all those things that are really, really key, because you don't want your paper to stand out because you didn't really sort of abide by the rules. That's a quick way to get your paper sent back to you. I thought I'd give you a little perspective. So this is a slightly old picture of my, my page when I log in as an editor. So all these journals have a platform that we use, a web-based platform. And if you've ever reviewed, which I'll talk about in a minute, you are also, you have a different view of that platform. But here's a platform where I might go in to my journal. I have a little time during the day or on a weekend, and I'm going to spend a few hours going through some of our papers. And this time I logged on, there were 7 new submissions since I'd logged on last. And you can see, if you look on there, there are new reviews, there are new submissions, there are reviews that need additional reviewers, there are reviews that are late. There are reviewers that never responded. That's no response. There's, at this point, none that I need to make a decision on, but there are 11 that are ready for a decision. So these are sort of some of the things, and I need to take the new submissions and send them out to reviewers. I need to take the reviews that I've gotten back and make decisions on those papers once we have enough reviews. So those are the different aspects of what we do. And this is sort of what's happened since I was there last. This view is actually sort of, I think it was done in, can't remember what, I think it was about halfway through the year. And this was showing me that I'd already gone through 388 papers in the last 4 or 5 months. And these were all the different aspects of it. But you can see there are a lot of, it's not just looking at a paper and deciding, what do I think of this? But there are lots of different aspects of the job of an editor that they're trying to juggle. And I say that just so that you think about trying to make things as smooth as you can in your submission process. So what is the process? So this is my process, and journal editors, I think we all do it a little differently. We actually, in surgery, we have a surgery journal editors group that meets a couple times a year. And I know a few friends who are journal editors. And when I first started, I would call them up and just tell me, how do you do it? I was an associate editor for a few years, so that was good preparation for me. And even now, when I have some tricky question, I'll call up a colleague who's a journal editor and ask them how they might handle this situation. But this is how I do it. So first, I'm going to look at a new submission, and I'm going to do whatever anybody else would do, right? I'm going to read the title. I might look at the authors. I'm going to read the abstract, and then I will skim the manuscript. And I need to think right up front, is this something that I want to publish in Journal of Surgical Education? And there are certain things that right up front this paper is not going to get past my initial review. We call that a desk reject in our journal. Other journals have different names for it. But there's some simple things that are just, it's not worth my time, and it's not worth an associate editor's time, and it's not worth a reviewer's time. And I try to be very protective of time because that's our sort of most precious resource. And as I've come to realize as an editor, I ask a lot of reviewers. And if you have reviewed, it takes time to do a good review. And so I don't want people reviewing papers that just, I know we're never going to publish. So here's a very common problem. It's surprising. But one problem we have is that sometimes I get submissions that are not about surgery and they're not about education. That's a pretty quick decision for the Journal of Surgical Education. And it amazes me that I still get submissions. I'll get case reports about some weird surgical procedure, has nothing to do about how you might teach it. Or I'll get things that literally are not even surgical. So that's a quick one. Sometimes they're so poorly written that I can't even follow the abstract. And that's, sometimes you can see there's some pearls in there that we might want to try to save it. But in many instances, if it's poorly written and it's just going to take so much time to sift through, it is not worth the review process. As I mentioned, formatting is important. So it needs to be in the appropriate format. And then sometimes there's really no science. Science is knowledge, right? And so if it's not generating new knowledge, it's not got any potential to advance what we're doing. It might be very descriptive and descriptive of something that doesn't really need or warrant description. It's going to get rejected. And so I will just desk reject those, and they get sent back with what we think is as nice a letter as we can make, just to say, sorry, but this is not of the caliber that things can move on. And, different journals are more selective than others. Our journal has become more and more selective. Our acceptance rate is about 24% now, which is relatively selective. And so in some instances, half the papers I will reject in a desk reject format because I just can tell what our bar is, and I know they're not going to reach that bar. So after I do that, the next step would be to assign reviewers. So there are a couple of options that we have as journal editors, and you may have had this experience when you submit where you're asked to recommend reviewers. And I can see those recommended reviewers. And so I often will look at those and see if those are people that I think would be potentially a good reviewer. I may or may not know them, but I can look them up online, or I can, we have a neat tool that helps share with us people's other things that people have published. That tool is in the publisher's website. And then I also look through the references of the paper that was written. And I look for people who they've cited who might be good reviewers who've written something similar. There's some artificial intelligence now that these websites have, so they can suggest to me reviewers that have written on a similar topic. And then now that I've been doing this for a fair amount of time, I know some of the people in my world of surgical education research. And honestly, I'll read a title and I go, I know exactly who I want to review that paper, and I'll send it to them. And so I will give you some advice for the reviewer, for the recommended reviewers. Most journals now ask that. I would really recommend you be somewhat thoughtful about that and give some people who could give an objective review. I'm amazed how often people will recommend somebody who is a close colleague in the same division or department, or maybe you as a prior mentor. And I sometimes know those connections. You want to give somebody who can be impartial and is going to give good feedback about your paper. And I find sometimes people brush through that, or I've had some people will not even put enough time in to give me a real name. So they'll give fake names. And that's a real turnoff. I must admit, if you want me to take my time and my reviewer's time to review your paper, and you can't take a few minutes to give me some names and email addresses, that's a turnoff. And then, so I send it out to reviewers, and then I wait for the reviews. And then often I wait longer for the reviews. And I'm going to talk to you about reviews, because if you ever review, please try to do it in a timely fashion, because the editors are waiting for your input. And then ultimately, I'll make a decision. But I want to talk about reviewing. And my biggest recommendation to you is, if you are given the chance to review for a journal, do it. Okay. First of all, most journals are looking for more reviewers. We always need more reviewers. I know it takes time. It's totally unpaid in general, but we're always looking for more reviewers. So if you know a journal that you like, or that you have published in, or is something you read a lot, if you have a chance, go up to that editor and say, if you ever need a reviewer, please, here's my name and email address. I can tell you every editor you go to will say thank you, and they will take it. And when people do that to me, I say, great, I'll send you one tomorrow. And because we're always looking for new reviewers, and people are motivated to review. But there are some other benefits to being a reviewer. You get to, if it's in your field, you get to learn what people are writing about. So you get to see stuff before it's published. And you get to see, if you're a author who's writing research papers, it's really good to see good and bad papers. And you can see some stuff that's done really well. And, I might want to, use that methodology in a future paper myself. And you see other papers that you're like, wow, I can write better than this. And, so you get to see the gamut of papers. You also learn a lot from other reviewers. And so I strongly encourage you, if you get to do a review, almost all the journals now, when they send a decision to the author, they will blind CC or send a copy to the reviewers. And if they don't do that, the other thing that they'll do is, if it gets resubmitted, you'll be able to read, it'll come back to you, you'll be able to read the reviews that the authors responded to. And I always encourage you to read the other reviewers' comments, because number one, it helps calibrate you as a reviewer. Oh, I thought this, I wonder what the other reviewers thought. But also, the other reviewers are usually pretty smart people, and you're going to learn something from them. So I encourage you to always read that. The other thing that's really important is it's part of the process. This is academics. The peer review process as it stands is really a form of citizenship. If you've ever gotten a paper published, other people spent hours in the review process. And so we all need to give back. This experience happens not infrequently to me, where literally I will have a paper submitted by an author, and I'll say, oh, that's a good paper, I'm going to send it out for review. And then that author's sort of on my mind. So I see another paper and I say, oh, that author who just submitted to me would be a great reviewer. And I send it to them and they decline the review the same day. And it just dawns on me, they're just not thinking about the citizenship process. And it's we all have to contribute to this. So I would encourage you to do it, and please try to get them done on time. Usually you get 2 or 3 weeks, and the editors rely on your input. It's really valuable. And, if you're still a trainee, I can't see everybody who's on right now. I find that residents and fellows typically do some of the best reviews. They want to make sure they do a good job. They haven't done it as much, but they really dive into the paper. And so some of my best reviewers are actually my own residents who I tap to do some reviews. And so if you're still a trainee, it's okay. You can be a reviewer. Okay, so now I need to make a decision. Now in our journal, we typically just send to 2 reviewers, but other journals, some send 3, some send 5, some send 10. It just depends on the journal. When I have 2 reviewers, hopefully they agree on their decision, because that makes my life easy. But they don't always. And the gradations we have is accept, there's reject, there's accept, minor revisions, and major revisions. And I will tell you, it's very rare that you will have a paper that gets an accept on the first submission. I don't know that that's ever happened to me. In a year where we accept 300 papers or so in our journal, we have 2 or 3 or 4 that will get just a straight accept without any revisions. For us, we sort of think of minor revisions as we're probably going to accept this, but you got to make some changes. And a major revision is, this needs a lot of work, but there's some kernels of good stuff in there, and we'll take another look if you really address these revisions. I would say it's always great as an author when you get something back and they offer you a revision, because the door is still ajar, right? You still have a chance, and jump on that and take advantage of it. But just remember, neither is a guarantee. Even if they say, well, minor revisions and we're likely to accept, it's not a guarantee. So just keep that in mind. So once you get that minor or major revision, I actually think this is where you really have to focus to get your paper across the finish line. So I feel very strongly about how you do revisions. And you have to read that review over and over again, and read it very closely, and make sure you understand everything that the reviewers are saying and that you're prepared to address them. And I would encourage you to take every comment very seriously. There's nothing that's more frustrating to a reviewer than for people to comment on a few of your, or respond to a few of your comments and just ignore some of the other ones, because you wouldn't have put them down if you didn't think they were important. So take every one of them seriously. And most journals have guidelines on how much time you have. It may be 30 days, 60 days, but just make sure you know what that is and get it done in time. And you really want to make it easy for the editor and the reviewers, because I'm going to tell you what happens next on our end. And the first way you do that is you need to make your revisions, but you need to write them a letter, okay? Because the first thing the reviewer and the editor are going to do with your resubmission is to look at that letter, okay? The cover letter on an initial submission is not that important, honestly, but the second cover letter on a revision is very important. So here's some advice that I have to be successful. And some of this I've been taught from mentors over the years, and some as an editor. But I strongly encourage you to be actually thankful and grateful for the review that you received. Realize that, first of all, as I said, people spent time reading and reviewing your paper. Most of your reviews take an hour or 2 to do. That's a considerable amount of time. And they almost always make your paper better. And so I would say that. And I recommend that you write a letter, dear Dr. So-and-so, address it to the editor that's managing your paper. Thank you for this review. And we are really grateful because it has improved our manuscript. Honestly, I would start that way every time. And maybe it sounds a little stiff, but I think it's important that you acknowledge that. And then the other thing I think is really important you acknowledge is every aspect of all the reviews. So what I do is I cut and paste those into the letter, and that helps me make sure that I include every part of the reviews. And even if they say, you know what, I really liked your introductory paragraph, I wouldn't change anything, then I would, right under that, I would say, thank you for this comment. and then sort of separate out. Sometimes they bullet point them, sometimes it's numbers, or sometimes just a big paragraph. But I would sort of separate out each point, quote what they said, and then underneath address each one. And what I recommend, and we have a format that we like, which is any changes you make in the manuscript, you highlight, but you actually highlight in the resubmission, but in your letter, you comment on each reviewer point, and then you say how it's changed in the manuscript, okay? And make it easy to read. You can do this with italics and indents and bullets and all those things, but you really want people to be able to have a very nice flow, because ideally, as an editor, what I like to do is I like to open that letter, and I remember the paper from when I sent it out before. I open the letter and I read through the letter and I go, wow, they really got good comments and they really addressed these well. And then I'm going to send it to my reviewers again, the people that reviewed it initially. And sometimes I'll look through it and say, wow, they did such a good job. I'm not even going to bother my reviewers. This paper is ready to go. And so we'll just accept it then. And sometimes I'll read through it and I go, wow, this is not in the format we recommended. And they don't seem like they address things. And that might be either I reject it or I send it back to them and I say, please put it in our format and please make sure you address all these points. It's always a challenge when the reviewer gives you some feedback that you may not totally agree with. I would say in general, it's very important that you listen to the reviewer. Not to change, if they tell you to change your study or your message, that's a different thing. But in general, they're giving you a perspective of not somebody who's been looking at these data and this paper for the last 6 months, but somebody who has a fresh perspective on it. They're going to give you good advice. And so I would, in general, listen to them, explain how you've changed the manuscripts. In our journal, we like to highlight the new changes. And we even say in our letter, when I tell people I would like you to revise the paper, it says exactly this. Write us a letter, bullet point everything, explain how you changed the manuscript, highlight the changes in the manuscript in yellow. I tell them, bold yellow. And then I say, don't use track changes, because I find track changes really hard to read as an editor. And I would say once a month, I get a paper sent back in track changes. And so I just write them, I just give them a revision again. And I say, just please read our format. Make sure whatever the format is that the journal likes your revisions to be in, please make sure you follow those. For us, if you're submitting to JSE, please don't use track changes. Okay, so what happens next? So we get the revision. I'm going to read your letter and I'm going to ask, did they address every point? I'm then going to read the paper. Can I see these changes? Do I like these changes? Do they fit? Do they make sense? And then I need to make a next assessment. Is this something I would like to see published in our journal? And as I said, sometimes I don't need to take the time of my reviewers again. I can tell that this paper is ready to go and it can be accepted. On occasion, I will say, you know what, this doesn't look like it's ever going to get there and it's going to get rejected. Most of the time, I'm going to send it back to the same reviewers that reviewed it the first time. And I want them to be comfortable that that their recommendations were addressed in an adequate fashion and that the paper is better and has gotten to the point where it's ready to be accepted. Now, sometimes that's one set of revisions. Sometimes it takes 2 or 3. Most of the time, 1 or 2. But it's really important that we all feel like it's at the stage where it's ready to be published, because I'm hoping that this happens for you and we get to the point where we can accept that great paper. So that's actually all I have as far as slides. I'm going to stop sharing and hope we can have a discussion. I actually haven't had a chance to look at the chat, except I see the number keeps going up. So I'm open to hear anything anybody has to say. Christina, if you want to open up the questions.
Yeah,
that
thank
was
you so
great.
much.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Eric. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. This is really enlightening. We have actually right now 3 fantastic questions. So I'm going to hit you with question number 1 first. This is from Ariel. Thank you, Ariel, for your great question. This is regarding when you are recommending who might be a reviewer for your paper. How close a connection is too close for a reviewer? So your own division seems far too close, but it's hard to know good reviewers for a topic if you don't have a lot of connections to them. So what do you recommend for people in suggesting reviewers for their papers?
So I do find that as an author to be a challenging question. I would say a couple of things that I would recommend is good people to ask are your co-authors, and particularly your senior author if you're not the senior author. Typically, the senior author may have a better knowledge of sort of the community of researchers that do work similar to yours. I would also think of who are some of the people we've cited who have written things on similar topics, particularly ones that you admire their work. And, you know, you're not obligated when you submit a list of names to have asked them if they're willing to do the review. That's the editor's job. You're just giving them some names of people you think could be good reviewers. And so it's pretty wide open. You know, I think if it's a mentor of yours, somebody you do other research with, I still think that's a little too close. It can be in the same institution, but not somebody who's a regular collaborator. I mean, I recently got an email from a reviewer that I asked to review a paper who said, you know, this is, I don't know if I can review this paper. This is my research resident. I'm not an author of this paper, but this is my research resident. And I said, that's interesting. I wouldn't have known that just by, I couldn't tell. But I said, you might give them a little advice that you're probably not the best person to pick because it's a little hard to be impartial. But if you think people could be impartial, and honestly, although it's hard to think this way, the review process, yeah, it's partially to make sure your paper's good, but it's also to make your paper better. So think of some people that you think would give good feedback to you. Now, some journals, more and more, the reviewer's name is sent back with their review. Not all, and most of them that do that, they give the reviewer the option as to whether to include their name or not. So you might find out actually who it is. So.
Fantastic. Thank you, Dr. Smink. And we've got another great question from one of our M.P.H colleagues, Ben Nelson. Thanks for being here, Ben. He says sometimes he has a bit of difficulty determining if his paper is a good fit for the scope of the journal, or even which type of submission would be appropriate for his work. What are your thoughts on emailing an editor or associate editor for a pre-submission inquiry regarding whether this paper sounds like something the journal would be interested in?
So that's a tricky question. I get a lot of those inquiries. And it's one thing if it's somebody who I don't know, you know, who I could understand might not know our journal. It's a little surprising to me. Sometimes I even get them from people on our editorial board asking me if they think this would be an appropriate submission to our journal. And I sort of expect those people should have a pretty good sense of what belongs or doesn't belong in our journal. I would say before you email the editor, I think you need to do your homework and you need to read some of those, you know, pull out a few of recent issues and look at what are they publishing and does this fit with what I'm writing. I would take a close look at the papers that you cited. What journals are they in? Because it would make logical sense that there would probably be some overlap. Just to put yourself in my shoes, I mean, I was at lunch today and I checked my email and I had gotten an email from a person asking if something was appropriate. It's just so hard as the editor, I can't circumvent the editorial process, right? And sometimes they send me the article, sometimes they just tell me about it. I don't think it's appropriate for me to make decisions outside of the process. So I really have to say, it sounds interesting, but I can't tell until I see it. And I can make a better decision on whether it requires review or not. And, it's a competitive process. So the only way to know is to submit it. And honestly, if you think it's the right journal, send it to that journal. You really don't have anything to lose. If it gets rejected, you can always send it to another journal. And if it gets accepted, you get a paper accepted. And yeah, you want your paper to go to the right level of journal. But published is published. So I think that's the biggest key.
Hey, Doug, a follow-up on that. What is the timeline that authors should expect from pushing go on submission to a rejection or acceptance?
Yeah. Well, some journals publish that, sort of their average or their expected. I can tell you our average for our journal from submission to initial decision is like 20 days or something like that. Now, that includes some that get rejected like within a day or two if they're a desk reject, and that means others are, if you're going to do the average, there might be some that are 40 days. I think anything beyond 2 months is too long, and you should feel comfortable just checking in, hey, I wanted to just make sure the status of my paper was okay. The challenge for an editor is I will send, I'll get a paper and I'll say, oh, this looks interesting. And maybe 5 days after it was submitted. And I'll send it to 2 reviewers who each have 21 days. And if you've ever done a review, I'm sure we've all done one late. So at 21 days, if they haven't submitted it, that's when it pops back on my sort of web portal and tells me that you don't have a review yet, at which point I might try to get that person to do it. Or I might pick a new person who then gets 21 days. So, it's, you'd like it to be quick. I think if it's gone beyond 2 months, that's probably too long. Ideally, you should hear within a month.
And I just editorialize, I think that's fabulous. I applaud your journal. My experience, and I don't know about the experience of others though, has been that in the education publishing world, expect a longer timeline than, if you will, the biomedical science, clinical science kind of publishing. And some journals, I feel like I've waited 3 to 6 months, unfortunately, but that just to set expectations a little bit. So.
Yeah, I would just agree with Eric on that. I've had 6 months for review, which feels like a very long time. I do want to say we have 2 great questions, one by Francesco and one by Deb. Francesco, do you want to unmute yourself and get your question out there?
Sure. So thank you very much for the amazing presentation. I really appreciate that. I'm often working with young doctors who are just getting into publishing. And I'm wondering if you have any advice to them about what is a good first step. There's a kind of a tradition here of, I'm in Japan, of publishing case studies as maybe being a first step. Do you think that that's a good first step for young researchers? Do you have your own thoughts on that?
Yeah. So I think there's I have a couple thoughts on that. I mean, one is just understanding the process of having an idea, writing it up, sending it in, responding to revisions, resubmitting. That's something that over time people get good at, right? And you've probably worked with people, you may be one of them yourself, who's, that you can sort of do that in your sleep. So there's that process, but then there's the process of doing the actual research, which is the methodology, the data collection, the analysis. A case study isn't going to teach you that so much. It might teach you the other part of the process. I would say, I'm not particularly fond of case studies. I just don't think there's a lot of science there. And I think both in clinical and education research, we're way beyond that. I don't see a heck of a lot of value in starting there. I think they're better off working with a mentor and trying to create some new knowledge and then write about it. And part of the process is the writing, and part of the process is the is developing a methodology and generating data. And the writing is just part of that. So I would encourage people, it doesn't have to be a huge project, it doesn't have to have 1,000 subjects, it could have 10, right? It could be quantitative, it could be qualitative. There are lots of different ways to do it, but my sense would be you're better off with sort of a simple data generating study, but with a mentor. I mean, that's the way we all learn this, right? It's really hard to learn the research process on your own. I just don't think people can do that very well. Some people can, but so I would, I guess I'd encourage the latter. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Juba, I see you have your hand up.
Yes, I definitely do not want to disagree with our chief discussant at all, but I think there are other options in terms of writing, which Francesco, you might find useful in advising your young writers. So, and there's a lot on educational scholarship, and I do workshops myself, which are titled Educational Scholarship. It's not just research. There are educational innovations that can be written up. So in a sense, Francesco, your case study might be an educational innovation. Now, how did you design an educational innovation? Was it systematically done? Was it done in a scholarly way? And did you use a framework or a model to describe this innovation? Was this something the world needs to know about with minimal data? So it's not research, it's innovation, but it's, you gathered a little bit of data, not a whole lot of data. And there are, in fact, I sent you in the chat, there are journals such as Perspectives in Medical Education. This is medical education, but there are others too. The clinical teacher, teaching and learning in medicine, I would group those, and medical teacher. If you're thinking medical education, they have so many formats of writing. So you can have 12 tips in medical teacher. In clinical teacher, you have toolbox, faculty development, insights. You have perspectives in other journals. So those may, and I think in teaching and learning in medicine, they call something like a case study, groundwork, I believe, which is you designed a new educational innovation or initiative, but then what is it? It's 100 people have done that. I'm the 101st person to have done that, but you should listen to me because I'm 101, I won the lottery. But that totally, as Doug says, they'll blow it out the door, like the three pigs and the wolf story. But if it's I have done this, that's, for example, if I've done an initiative in Boston, and then someone says, I'm going to take some aspects of this, but then adapt it to the Japanese culture, then other people will want to know about that, particularly from Asia, might want to know about that. So that's, I think I've taken too much time, but those are.
Doug, can I ask a question that I suspect on many people's minds? What is there a cost to the author for publishing? And can you also explain what open access means and how that differs in the process?
So there is, in general, no, there's not, I mean, a financial cost, no, in general, there's not. In most journals, certainly most peer-reviewed journals, open access, I think, well, there are certainly journals where you can literally pay to get your paper published. That's I think what most people would call a predatory journal. And it's usually not peer reviewed. We have open access. I think most journals now allow that or include that as an option. I, as the editor, don't ever know if somebody is planning to do open access or not. That is determined, or they are given that option after the decision has been made and it gets to the publishing point. And some institutions require it. Some grantors, if it's grant funded, require it. I think some, like, maybe be some countries that require their authors to do it. So that's fine. Honestly, there's nothing wrong with that as long as it doesn't influence the peer review process. So, I think open access for us is in the $2,000 to $3,000 range. And, you know, if you're submitting a grant, for instance, and it's required, you build that into the grant, that we plan to publish 5 papers, and, you know, that's $15,000 right there. So there's nothing wrong with it. I think people worry that it impacts our decision. We don't see it.
And for those who don't understand it completely, if you publish through a journal, they own the copyright to your published material. And hence the reason they can then market that to an institution for a fee. But open access means essentially they don't own the copyright. So it's open to the public, if you will. So you could pull it up on PubMed and download the PDF directly, essentially.
Right.
Other questions?
Oh, I would just make a comment to Deb's question. I think open access journals does not by default mean predatory in any sense.
Correct.
Paying does not by default mean predatory in any sense. I think you have to do your due diligence, seeing where they're indexed. Are they indexed in places where people can find them? Who's recently published in that journal? Do you know any of those people? Are there names that you recognize? And things like that can give you a sense of whether or not it is predatory. Also, some predatory journals like to email you and say, oh, esteemed colleague, submit to this journal. When you read between the lines, they are looking for, you know, money in a journal that is not high quality. So you have to have a little bit of healthy skepticism when you're searching out a journal that you're not familiar with.
And you need to make clear that it's peer reviewed, because in the academic world, what any university is going to want to see is that you're actually getting, if they're looking at your publications, they want to see that they're peer reviewed publications. That is definitely a step above. And a lot of the predatory journals are typically not peer reviewed.
One final question while we finish up the hour. Anyone out there, or Christina, any that you see on the chat?
I'm not seeing any more in chat, but I would just thank everybody for some really fantastic questions here.
Doug, I think that was just the most practical approach for everyone to hear, and I know appreciated by all of us here, and many probably who are going to watch this moving forward. So thank you so much. I wish all of you a great afternoon or a good night wherever you are in the world, and hope you can join us for our next program. Have a great day.
Thanks for having me.